Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of our new topic, moving on from the Renaissance, right? I don't know why I did that with my tie, but the big thing about it, though, is we are moving on from the Renaissance. We're now getting into the period known as European exploration, right? We're moving into a subject content that I'm extremely well versed in, and something, ironically enough, that I'm pretty good at teaching, all right? It's like I don't know why, but it's just very simple, right? It's very simple to be like, oh, this happened, effect. This happened, effect. These two people don't like each other, etc., etc., etc. Atrocities committed, right? Borderline genocide. We'll talk about all that stuff, though, in this next unit, or not next unit, in the second half of this first unit, right? So the thing we left off in class talking about, though, is we were discussing with each other about how the period that's known as European exploration is right smack all up in the middle of the Renaissance era itself, because we looked at the Sistine Chapel ceiling, that was actually painted from 1508 to 1512 by Michelangelo, and that is after the voyage of Columbus that we will talk about in this flip, maybe, possibly. If we don't get to it, it's completely fine. So now, we will actually talk about that, though, at some point during the back half of this unit, and we will discuss how his voyage took place in 1492, years before the Sistine Chapel ceiling was ever painted. And then also Martin Luther, his Reformation, and the Protestant Reformation will begin in 1517. So as you can see, a lot of stuff going on in the 14 and 1500s in Europe, right? A calamity of things going on all at the same time, you could say, right? Because the reason why it's important to know that all these things are going on at the same time is because the Renaissance helped cause the exploration period and the Reformation, right? The Reformation is going to then help push a lot of these early explorers to try and push their religion as aggressively as they possibly can, etc., etc., cause effect, tug and pull, push and pull factors, right? Big thing about it, though, okay, let's go ahead and dive straight into it, and we're going to start talking about why hadn't the Europe. So the first big question when we're discussing exploration that we have to ask ourselves is, why hadn't Europeans done this earlier? Now, the list that we're about to talk about pretty in-depth is going to be both questions of why they hadn't done it earlier, but they're also going to serve as well as motivators for why they get involved with it relatively soon, right? So one of the biggest reasons that we're going into why Europeans had not already gone out and tried to find new trade routes and things like that is, first of all, before we go any further, you have to understand they did make attempts, and we'll talk about that here in a few minutes, but they just didn't go very well. And a lot of reasons why they didn't go very well is mostly due to the fact that the Middle Ages was a time period where there was very low technological output, right? The reason why people during the 1100s AD, the 1000s AD, the 900s AD, right, during that medieval era, hadn't gone off and tried to find newer, faster ways to get to places like India, China, into the Indian Ocean, where all of these goods that they really wanted, like pepper and spices and silks and teas and porcelains, where they were located. The reason why is just because they just didn't have the technology to do so, right? Middle-aged ships at the time could not go that far, right? And then also the design of their sails made it so they could really only sail in certain directions given positive weather conditions, right? Now, interestingly enough, though, the Easterners had figured this out a long time ago, how to change the shape of their sails, how to use rudders and the compasses and directional navigational systems, which we'll talk about all that stuff in a little bit, because eventually the Europeans are going to acquire these things, right? But the big reason why the Middle Ages was a time period where you didn't see a lot of exploration is mostly just because of low technology, right? Now, these two next things we're about to talk about are going to be reasons why they had not done it earlier, but also are going to serve as reasons as why they went off and decided to go off and do this, right? Now, when we're looking at this, the Venetians, right, which when we say Venetian, we mean people from Venice in northern Italy, right, one of the big three northern Renaissance states. What we need to understand, though, is that Europeans during this time period at first didn't need to go off and find these new routes because the Venetians were the ones bringing it all in, right? Venice was the one that had a trade embargo with the Byzantinians and later on with the Ottomans, right? Now, when they had this trade embargo, what I mean by that is that the Venetians were the only ones that were allowed to trade directly with this end of the Silk Road city known as Constantinople and bring in those items that everybody wanted, the silks, the teas, the spices, right? Now, going into it, though, that is also going to serve later on as an impetus to try and find new routes to get there. But again, take that thing where the Venetians are already doing it and couple it together with low technology, and that's a big reason why it took them so long until the 1400s to actually make this happen, right? Now, another big motivator and reason why this is going to happen, though, is because Constantinople will eventually fall, right? The Europeans had not done this earlier because of the fact that there were very large Muslim kingdoms on the other side of Constantinople that were growing very, very rapidly and cutting off any access that they had to try and get to places like India. And we'll do a map here in a little bit, and I'll show you exactly what I mean by that. But Constantinople will fall in 1453 AD, and it falls to the Ottoman Turks, right? It then gets its name changed to Istanbul and is now now a part of what's known as the Ottoman Empire, right? The thing that you need to understand, though, is you're going to highlight that last one. Constantinople, when it falls in 1453, will cause prices to rise, right? Because Muslims are going to charge more to the Venetians for them to actually move these products. And now this is going to serve as another reason why they want to go off and find these goods for cheaper, right? But again, it's that low technology problem, which we're going to cover again here in a few minutes, okay? Now, a good comparison, though, just to show you the difference between the Middle Ages and the Eastern Golden Age, how literally the Easterners of like China, the Arabic countries, like the Islamic kingdoms, like also Western Africa, were actually growing very, very rapidly, and just show you that people had been exploring long before the people from Europe ever got involved, is first of all, I love talking about this guy, right? Mansa Musa, right? Just so we understand going forward, a lot of people think that Europeans just like flat out have invented everything, went off and did everything or whatever, but that's flat out not true. The richest man in all of history is actually an African man, right? His name was Mansa Musa, right? And he was the king of the Malian Empire, right? And the Malian Empire were like expanded all the way from the eastern coast of Africa and what is now the modern day Mali, and then also literally he had so much money, y'all, that when Mansa Musa traveled to places, he caused inflation, right? So he is a good example of the Eastern Golden Age and how literally this whole idea of low technology and low trade, that's a European problem that they needed to figure out, right? Because literally they knew about him. That right there is a medieval map that has Mansa Musa in the middle of Africa just like holding gold and being fabulous, right? Now, another big way that you can actually see the difference between these two things as well is when we look at the treasure fleet of Zhang He, right? Zhang He was a part of the Ming dynasty of China, right? He was one of their generals and admirals, and he had these things known as had these boats that were in this thing called the treasure fleet, right? The treasure fleet literally was made up of vessels that were 3 times the size of a boat that Columbus would have actually sailed to get to the New World. Like, look at the size of this bad boy, right? They were massively huge, and they would traverse the entirety of the Indian Ocean trade network, right? Going all the way from China, hitting India, getting all the way to West Africa, and coming all the way back again, right? Why am I talking about that, though? Because this is another reason to show you that that is how powerful and intense these Eastern kingdoms were. So really, in essence, had the Europeans not eventually gotten in contact with these people, they wouldn't have explored squat. They wouldn't have done anything. Because their earliest attempts were marred with unsuccesses, right? One of the earliest attempts to try and find a route to India, to get into the spice market, to get into the silk markets of China, was a man that y'all probably heard of before. A man by the name of Marco Polo, right? Marco Polo was a Venetian scholar, trader, and things like that as well. And he traveled by foot to try and get to India, realizing it wasn't possible. And to also just show you the Middle Ages value, the idea that the medieval people just did not know what was going on a worldly scale. They believed at one point that there was a white guy in Africa named Prester John. And he was on their maps, right, in Western Africa. They were like, oh, there is this European man who is Christian and has gotten cut off from Europe, and he's over there, and, like, he's, like, leading another community of white Christians. And yeah, that's not true. That guy did not exist, right? But medieval Europeans believed this full-heartedly. Kind of shows you why they really needed the Renaissance to pop up and that humanism doctrine so they could catch up with all of these other people. And speaking of, the technology will be the thing that gives them the ability to kind of start catching up a little bit. Now, all of these things right here that are listed, okay, are pieces of technology that are going to make it possible for Europeans to finally start actually exploring some of these different areas and trying to find their own trade routes to get to India and get involved in these different trade networks during the 1400s primarily, right? There were some early voyages in the 1300s as well. The Basque people, for example, from Spain claim that they actually were the very first ones to discover North and South America. That's up for conjecture, but okay, I think it's still really, really cool. The technology, though, that you're seeing that are laid out in all these pictures, right? For example, the caravel ship, which is a smaller, lighter trade vessel that is much easier to maneuver, is modeled off of not European boats, but Eastern boats, right? They modeled those off of Chinese trade vessels, right? The lateen rig, all right, which is a shape of a sail, that right there is a lateen, right? See how it's triangular in shape, right? The lateen sail, also modeled off of Chinese and Arabic trading ships, is a triangular sail that allows you to catch wind in either direction, right? So you can actually sail into the wind or with it. Now, another big one is going to be the compass as well, which is going to make its debut in Europe during the 1200s. Now, this bad boy, okay, is going to originally be invented by the Chinese, and it uses uses magnetic declination so you can actually figure out what direction you're heading in, right? Y'all know what a compass is, though. Now, another big one, though, is called a stern post rudder, which is actually a rudder that is connected to a chain that is actually connected to the ship's, like, steering wheel and stuff like that, so they can actually direct the ship in any direction that they need to go, and also use those lateen riggings and those new triangular sails to sail in any direction they want to go. Other advances as well include cartography, because, like, which, by the way, cartography is the science of map making, right? And so the science of making maps was getting infinitely better, right? And since cartography was getting better, Europeans also knew how to actually, like, what's the word I'm looking for? Specifically find their place on a map, know where they are, use that compass to also get to where they need to go. That right there is the actual map of the globe. That right there is a globe of the world that was released in 1492, right before Columbus set sail. It's just missing a couple of continents. We'll get to that later, okay? Now, going into it, though, also, so cartography is advancing and map-making sciences are getting a lot better. And also, navigational tools like the astrolabe and the quadrant are getting a lot better as well. These were actually originally invented by people of the Muslim empires, right? The Muslim empires, the Umayyad Caliphate, had, like, scholars that had invented these devices. They actually used sights on them to locate where the North Star is in the sky, and then use these angular, like, measurement devices to try and figure out how far the horizon is away from where the, like, North Star is located. And by using what time of year it is, and also by using, like, this device, you can figure out what your latitude is on the Earth and how far up or down you are on it, right? So that's another big one. And as well, another big thing is guns and gunpowder. Now, really quickly, you don't need guns and gunpowder to actually, like, navigate squat, but they're going to come in really, really important whenever they start meeting natives in the Americas, and then also whenever they start running into West Africans, and then also whenever they start running into some of these Asiatic kingdoms, right? Because guns and gunpowder was something that was invented primarily by Europeans, even though, ironically enough, gunpowder was invented by the Chinese in about 900 AD. Now, look, the other thing that we need to understand, though, as well, is that the big motivations behind European exploration, right? What are those three intrinsic motivating factors that led them off to going and doing these different things? Well, the way that a lot of instructors, both college, high school, like all of us, okay, teach these big three motivators as the reason why Europeans wanted to go off and try to discover new areas and try to find their way to get to India and try to find their way, like to colonizing new places, right? All start with G, and there's three of them, right? And they go this one, and that one, right? And each G stands for something that is really just an easy way to remember why and when they did this, all right? Well, not when, but why they did this, right? So the era of exploration was, of course, caused by none other than gold, right, to start off with, okay? Gold, of course, when we use that word gold, we don't mean actual, well, we do mean physical gold, but we also use the overlying term gold to refer to the idea of money, right? Like, now, the biggest reason, that is probably the biggest reason, it's the reason why I have it listed the highest, okay? Gold and the expansion of trade routes is going to be the biggest indicator or the biggest cause, the biggest push for Europeans to go off and try to find new sea routes to get to new places to involve themselves in trade that have been going on for over 1,000 years in the Indian Ocean. Now, they wanted this gold to, like, come in the form of luxury goods, like from the Eastern kingdoms, like silks and spices and porcelains, and to be able to kind of bring those in and then sell them to other countries that did not have trade access routes to places like India. And basically what they were trying to do is they were trying to cut the Ottomans out of the game, right? After the 1453, when Constantinople falls to the Ottoman Empire, what their goal is to cut the middleman out, right? Because the Ottomans weren't the ones making the silk, making the spices, making the porcelain. They were the ones bringing it in and then selling it again to the Europeans at a massive markup, right? So they could make a lot of money. What they wanted to do, the Europeans anyway, is they wanted to get all the way to India and buy it from the source itself, right? And so by doing that, they would then get the profit, right? Now, what this is going to lead to, though, is something that we'll talk about a lot later on, is the growth of this concept called mercantilism. Do not ask me why the College Board wants me to talk about it now before it even exists, which I find to be so dumb and doesn't make any sense. I really hope there's a College Board person, like, listening to these being like, what do you mean we shouldn't talk about it now? Because mercantilism didn't exist until the late 1500s, and we're trying to talk about what motivated people to do this, so you can't be motivated by something that doesn't exist yet. But what it is, mercantilism is the concept in an economy, okay? It's the economic system that will eventually be adopted by Europeans, where they genuinely believed that there was only so much money in existence, right? Like, for example, if you look at me up in this top right-hand corner, they basically believed that this is how much money existed in the world, right? Think of it like kind of like a pie chart, right? Or like kind of just like a grid itself. That this is how much there is, right? And that there's only so much to go around. So these other European countries wanted to go off and explore stuff because they want to make sure that their slice of the pie is bigger than everybody else's slice of the pie, right? And though in their mind, they were like, if we don't get there now, they're not making anymore, right? Which is actually going to be proven wrong due to the fact that when they get to South America, they discover buttloads of gold and silver, and it ends up having so much so they find that it crushes the Spanish economy. But anyway, the other big thing about it, though, is mercantilism is going to be adopted later on, and it's going to be adopted because of the period of exploration, and the way that you regulate it is by doing these things called tariffs, right? So basically what they were trying to do is they wanted to be the ones that go off and get these items and sell them from, like, if you're a French, like, trader, you want to sell items from France, right? And you want to be exporting things, not importing things. And the way that you can prevent your consumers from buying imported goods, right? Because if you buy an imported good, your money's now out there. It's gone. It's leaving. It's going away, right? And so like now, but if you, the way you do it is by slapping a tariff on it, right? Or making like foreign goods very, very high price, right? And what a tariff is a tax on a foreign imported good. We'll talk more about mercantilism when I can draw it on the board and stuff like that and discuss how it will be adopted later on, mostly due to the growth of like the spice trade and stuff like that. But really quickly, I just know that we're going to talk about mercantilism quite a bit for the next little while. But again, I don't know why the College Board forces me to talk about it now. It's so dumb. It just doesn't feel right. Now, going into it, though, the other G, though, is God, right? The example of this is to spread Christianity, right? You have to understand that this became a major motivator, especially after the Reformation started, right? When the Reformation began and people were beginning to leave the Catholic Church, right, and go towards the Protestant Church, what this is going to end up causing is a mad dash to try and convert as many of these new people that the Europeans are coming into contact with to either Catholicism and or Protestantism, right? Now, the thing about it, though, that you can also see this as well, on the back end of the Reformation, a group of priests are going to be created, okay? And these are, again, in the later 1500s. This is started by this guy named St. Ignatius of Loyola. They're known as the Jesuits, right? And y'all know the Jesuits, right? The high school in the nearby area and stuff like that. Well, Jesuit missionaries were actually sent to the Americas to try and convert the native populations to Catholicism, right? Now, that's a really great example because it actually demonstrates to us direct people that were sent by the church to go off and try to use education and conversion as a way of growing the faith, right? Now, the thing about it, though, also that we need to understand is it will be used in a negative way as well, okay? Because, for example, many conquistadors that we'll talk about a little bit later on, like Columbus himself, believed that they had the right to destroy, enslave, and violate native populations if they refused to adopt Christianity. Because, you know, you just showed up and started talking about some guy they've never heard of before, and you expected them to just, like, literally kneel down and worship a new religion, which was ridiculous. Now, like, so going into it, though, we'll talk about that a little bit later on, though. So God is the big one to spread Christianity. And then last but not least is just glory, right? You just want to be better than everybody else, right? Gold, God, glory, right? Glory is just the idea that my country owns more than your country, and it makes me awesome, right? Whenever you win a sports game, there's glory that goes along with it. And Europeans considered glory at this point as in controlling, owning, and taking over more land. Now, really quickly, though, a lot of y'all are probably asking yourself as well, though, well, Mr. Terry, why didn't they just go east, right? Like, why didn't they just, like, head in this direction, right? So if you're talking about some of these early countries, let's, like, take Spain right here, okay? Why didn't Spain just go, like, through France, over this stuff, cut down through Turkey, and then get to India that way, right? Couldn't you have just gone through land? Well, one of the biggest reasons why you can't do that is because the Muslim world will not allow Christian traders through their empire. Ever since the Crusades, this area right here on the map, okay, I'm going to make the cursor real big, this area right here on the map, and also in northern Africa, is controlled by the Muslim population, all right, or by the Umayyad Caliphate at this point, right? So these caliphates refuse to allow Christian traders to move through their land, all right? And since they refuse to allow you to do that, you would be arrested, possibly like executed and things like that. So traders weren't allowed to go through this direction. Well, better question is like, okay, well, why don't we pull a Marco Polo and try to go this way over them, right? And that's exactly what Marco Polo did. In the 1200s, 200 plus years before Columbus ever set out on his voyage, Marco Polo started in Venice and went and then went up through Russia, down through Kazakhstan, ended up in China, but realized that, man, it's cold out here, and then also there's a big mountain range right there that you can't just cross on any given day, called the Himalayas, that prevented him from actually getting into India. But he did bounce around China quite a bit and stuff like that. but eventually, of course, he returns home unable to access India by a direct land route. And then also later on, these folks, this whole area up here in Russia at this point, and then also in northern China, was controlled by a group of people called the Mongolians, right? Now, the Mongolians, I'm sure you've heard of before at the time, were being led by Genghis Khan and his descendants, right? And the Golden Horde had taken over all of Russia, all of Mongolia, all of what is modern-day Kazakhstan as well. But what eventually happens also in the 1300s is they convert to Islam and then refuse to let Christian traders through as well. So that's the biggest reason. You can't just go east, right? And you can't just cut through this area of Africa because that's the Sahara Desert, or that's the Sahara. Don't say Sahara Desert because the word Sahara means desert. You're basically saying desert. So the big thing about it is the Sahara is right here. Can't go that way. And then also just trying to traverse this area of Africa is not going to happen because it's dense jungle, and that literally is going to get you malaria and you'll die. So they had to take sea routes. That's why they couldn't just go this direction. They had to figure out a way. Do I go around Africa or where do I go, right? And the thing about it, though, is the first two European countries that are going to begin to beg this question. All right, sorry about that real quick. Had to actually fix the editing on this Prezi. It was geeking out a little bit and stuff like that. But anyway, the first two countries to actually hit the seas first during this period that you would refer to as European exploration, right, of course, which is more like European takeover stuff that doesn't belong to you and, you know, murder and borderline genocide a bunch of people. But the big thing about this, the first two European countries that are going to get involved are none other than Spain and Portugal, okay? I said that backwards, but I should say Portugal and Spain because Portugal actually gets involved first, but still. Now, if we jump back to this map real quick, you do desperately need to know where Spain and Portugal are located, right? Because, like, intrinsically where they are located, it's going to kind of actually be like, oh, I see why they would have been the first ones to go off and do that, right? So Spain is located right here, okay, with direct access to the Mediterranean and to the Atlantic Sea, and then Portugal is located right next door to it, okay? Now, what's going to end up happening, though, is when we're talking about these two countries, we always like to talk about Portugal first, right? And we start off by talking about the prince of, like, Portugal, not their king, but their prince, right? He's the brother of the king of Portugal at the time, and his name was Henry the Navigator, right? And Henry the Navigator is going to invest a ridiculous amount of funds into trying to grow this, like, Portuguese trade empire and try to find a way all the way to India. Now, his goal is to go all the way around Africa, right? He wants to go all the way around Africa to find the direction to get to India, okay? Now, in this process, though, they end up actually bouncing around the areas or the edges of Africa, looking for any other, like, goods that they can find, including gold, including sugar as well. Now, the thing that's going to end up happening, though, is yes, he sponsored these things, and yes, he tried to actually get them going, but he dies in 1460, right? Like, so we're talking like 37 years before, like, literally Vasco da Gama, one of his later sailors, gets all the way there. But major results do come about of the voyages that he sponsored, right? And the biggest results are the fact that the Portuguese did begin to establish one of the worst things that's ever existed in all of history. They are the ones who began to establish the African slave trade network that propped up their exploration economy while they were trying to find their way to get to India. And they began using the slave trade system to not only grow sugar as well on the western coast of Africa, but they also set up what is known as trade posts. Right now, a trade post empire for the Portuguese is going to become important as we keep going, okay? And they used African resources to try while they were trying to find this route to India, okay? So, for example, if any of you have ever seen the film Amistad, which is about a group of, like, slaves actually overtaking a slave ship, and we'll talk about the slave trade system that actually popped up a little bit later on, all right? So during, like, a little bit later in the, like, during this section of our unit. But the big thing about it is, like, literally when the slaves took over the ship, there was a communication breakdown between the sailors that were sailing it and the slaves that had taken it over, and literally it was because the sailors spoke Portuguese, right? Like, so, and they actually ended up taking them to America anyway. Now, a couple of later Portuguese explorers, though, are going to successfully get all the way to India. Now, the first one that tried and failed is a guy by the name of Bartholomew Diaz. He actually got all the way down to the bottom of Africa down here, but he referred to that area as the Cape of Storms, right? Because he said that basically there were so many storm patterns that were happening in the southern tip of Africa next to what is now modern-day South Africa that you can't traverse it or could not get past it, right? Now, later on, though, the very first guy to get all the way around the Cape of Storms at the time, quote-unquote, was a man by the name of Vasco da Gama, okay? And he does this in 1498. He's the very first person to get all the way to India and all the way back. And he took 4 boats and 170 men. But he only came back with about, like, 100, not even 100. Mr. Roddy, what's 170 divided by 2? Isn't that like 85? 85? 85, am I right? It's 85? Yeah. Now, look, so I love asking a question then finding out the answer first. Now, look, big thing about it, though, okay, when we're looking at this, 85 sailors made it back, or give or take, about 50% of his crews made it back because a bunch of them died from scurvy, which is a disease you get from a vitamin C deficiency, and your teeth fall out and your hair gets brittle. It's gross. Now, the big thing about it, though, okay, when we're looking at this, the spices that he brought back, though, because they can't get scurvy, are going to sell for a ridiculous amount of money, establishing the Portuguese as a very, very, very large competitor in this new maritime trade market, right? Now, when he got past the southern tip of Africa, though, they renamed it. Instead of being the Cape of Storms, they now renamed it the Cape of Good Hope, right? And you can actually see it on this map right here, the Cape of Good Hope, right? And literally, because if you can get past Cape of Good Hope, you can get to India. And Portuguese now are going to have trading, or now going to be trading spices, silks, porcelain, tea, slaves, sugar, and a lot of other items that are going to make them ridiculously wealthy, right? Now, for a short period of time, because this is going to attract, of course, attention, right? It's going to attract attention from a lot of other European powers, including the British and the French and the Dutch, right? They come out of nowhere. Remember where the Dutch people are from. The Netherlands is important. And then also, though, the thing about it, though, is the way they're going to do this is that the Portuguese set the standard by using a trade post empire, right? What they literally set up around Africa was trade posts, so they would just bounce around the outside of Africa until they got all the way to India and brought all their goods all the way back, right? But the big thing about it, though, is that's where we're going to cut this off, and we're going to talk about Spain in our next class. But I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.